Good morning, 8x2 on this sunny, at least where I am, Friday morning. I hope you're healthy and well, and hopefully you're looking forward to your return to the classroom, which seems to be happening next week. So this may very well be the last remote lesson that I set for you. Hooray! I'm sure you're as thrilled as I am. But with that in mind, let's move directly on to our next lesson. We are continuing with Oliver Twist, which we are going to try and finish before the end of this half term. So let's move on to chapter 6 now. We're going to continue to develop our ability to write about a text while we continue reading the story itself. And today we're going to meet a character called Mr. Fang, who is a figure of law and justice. But to begin with, please take a single minute or two out to do this starter. Basically, I'm asking you to write a quick summary of what you remember happened in the previous lesson, what brought us to where we are now. A bullet point, a sentence is enough. Do that now, please. Now, you hopefully remembered that among the other things that we read last week, that a key point was that Oliver got caught by the police for pickpocketing. Now, of course, he wasn't the one who did the pickpocketing, but he ended up taking the blame, and his so-called friends ran off and left him with the police. He's now being dragged in front of a magistrate. He is going in front of the law and justice of Victorian England, and Dickens seems to have some very strong ideas about this so-called law and justice, especially in the way that he presents the character of Mr. Fang. The name itself is significant, and you might think about what a fang is and what it represents. Does it sound like a nice, friendly person, or someone who might be harsh and vicious? Now, what we're looking to be able to do is to identify within a text, within what we're reading today, quotes. A quote being an exact copy of writing from a text. You normally want to keep them precise and short. 1 or 2 words, a short phrase, that's enough. Once you've got a quote, you want to be able to explain why it's relevant. The idea here is that you're clarifying, you're making a point. You're saying, this quote shows that Mr. Fang is an unpleasant individual. Why does it do that? And that's where you clarify. That's where you explain why the word or quote you've chosen is meaningful for answering a question. Like the one here, how does Mr. Fang represent Dickens' idea about law in Victorian England? So with this in mind, let's turn to our reading now. At this point, please open the PDF that's attached to this assignment. It's a single page from the larger abridged version of Oliver Twist. So let's turn to that now so we can do our reading together. And I'll try and explain a few bits along the way for you. Chapter 6. Mr. Fang. The magistrate's office was a sort of wooden pen where Oliver was deposited, trembling. Behind a bar, at the upper end, sat Mr. Fang. Mr. Fang was a long-backed, stiff-necked, middle-aged man with a stern, flushed face, who was in the habit of drinking rather more than was good for him. The old gentleman bowed respectfully and handed him over his business card. Now Mr. Fang was in a temper and looked up with an angry scowl. "Who are you?" said Mr. Fang. The old gentleman pointed to his card and said, "That is my name and address, sir." "Officer!" said Mr. Fang, tossing the card contemptuously away. "Who is this fellow?" "My name, sir," said the gentleman, "is Mr. Brownlow." "Officer!" snarled Mr. Fang. "What's this fellow charged with?" "He's not charged at all, sir," replied the police officer. "He appears against the boy, your worship." "Appears against the boy, does he?" said Mr. Fang, surveying Mr. Brownlow contemptuously from head to foot. "Swear him in." "Before I am sworn, I must beg to say one word." "Hold your tongue, sir," snapped Mr. Fang. "I will not, sir," replied the old gentleman. "Hold your tongue this instant, or I'll have you turned out of the office," said Mr. Fang. "You're an insolent, impertinent, impudent fellow. How dare you bully a magistrate?" "What?" exclaimed the old gentleman, reddening. Now, there are a few good points to pull out from what we've just finished reading. We're going to finish the rest of it in a moment. So, begin by looking at the description of Mr. Fang. Long-backed, stiff-necked, middle-aged, stern, flushed, drinks too much. As a description of this magistrate, of this figure of justice, it's not very complimentary. So stiff-necked suggests that he doesn't like to change his opinion. It's a physical description, but it says something about his personality as well. He's middle-aged. Older people, my age and beyond, tend to be a little bit less flexible in their views often. He's stern. He's got a flushed face, so it's always red, which suggests either he's angry, he's passionate, or he's drunk. Because we get told then that he has a habit of drinking rather more than is good for him. If he is a drinker, you might question how capable he is of doing his job properly. You should also notice the way in which Mr. Fang deals with the old gentleman. Now, we don't know much about his character, but he has been described up to now in quite a considerate way. And he represents a certain class of people within the novel. Someone who's upper class and who's generally used to being treated with a certain level of respect. Respect he's not finding here. In fact, it's quite the opposite. And yet he's done absolutely nothing wrong other than stand there and hand a card over informing Mr. Fang of whom he is. And look the way he responds. First, he refuses to talk to him. He only speaks to the officer. "Officer, who is this fellow? Officer, what's this fellow charged with?" He gets it wrong. He thinks it's about the gentleman and not about the boy. The language used to describe the way Mr. Fang speaks is important too. Tossing the card contemptuously. Surveying Mr. Brownlow contemptuously from head to foot. So doing that slow scan over the whole body. And then the way he speaks, he snaps. He calls the gentleman insolent, impertinent, and impudent. And then, bizarrely, accuses him of bullying. So everything about the way Mr. Fang is presented here presents him as almost a bit juvenile, as loud and aggressive, and clearly the one who's being disrespectful here. "What?" exclaimed the old gentleman, reddening. "Swear this man," said Fang to the clerk. "I'll not hear another word. Swear him." Mr. Brownlow's indignation was greatly aroused, but he suppressed his feelings and was sworn at once. "Now," said Fang, "what's the charge against this boy? What have you got to say, sir?" "I was standing at a bookstall." "Hold your tongue, sir," said Mr. Fang. "Policeman! Where's the policeman? Swear this man. Now, what's this?" The policeman related how he had searched Oliver and found nothing on his person. "Are there any witnesses?" inquired Mr. Fang. "None, your worship," replied the policeman. Mr. Fang sat still for some minutes, then turning to the prosecutor, said in a towering passion, "Well, do you mean to state what your complaint against this boy is, man, or do you not? You have been sworn. If you stand there refusing to give evidence, I'll punish you for disrespect. I will. Now, what's your name, you young scoundrel?" Oliver tried to reply, but his tongue failed him. He was deadly pale, and the whole place seemed turning round and round. "What's your name, you hardened scoundrel?" demanded Fang. "Officer, what's his name?" Oliver gasped that he needed some water. "He says his name's Sam Waters, your worship," said the police officer. "Has he any parents?" asked Fang. In this passage that we've just read, you can see how Mr. Fang interacts with other people. Notice, for example, the forms of punctuation he uses. "Swear this man!" exclamation mark. "I'll not hear another word. Swear him!" exclamation mark. "What's the charge against this boy? What have you got to say, sir?" Question. Okay, it's set up almost in a, well, not almost, definitely in a comedic style. You can imagine this person thrashing around, looking this way, looking that way, exclaiming loudly, Everything's an exclamation. Everything is a demand from someone else. So the punctuation says something about the way this man communicates and his personality. When he speaks to the prosecutor, it's in a towering passion. And he has a go at the prosecutor, the lawyer who is presenting the case against Oliver. Do you mean to state what your complaint against the boy is, man, or do you not? I mean, the man hasn't even had an invitation to begin yet. He's just being yelled at for not having already done a thing he wasn't asked to do. Says something about Mr. Fang there. He turns to Oliver, and we get this good description of Oliver. He's deadly pale, and the place seems to be turning round and round. Now remember at this point that Oliver hasn't had much of a break. He's walked all the way from the countryside into London. He immediately got scooped up by Fagin and the Artful Dodger. He hasn't had much time to rest, and he is actually very ill. He's also had an unfortunate encounter with some police officers. He's in no shape to be dealing with what's happening here or to cope with the stress being presented at him. He's clearly not a hardened criminal, and yet of course Fang demands of him, "You hardened scoundrel," which simply does not match up with what Oliver is or how he's presenting himself at this point. And then of course we return to the question of his parents. Has he any parents? As almost like the classic example of an orphan in English literature. This comes back quite a bit, and the question of Oliver's parentage is a very important one for this novel. He says his name's Sam Waters, your worship, said the police officer. Has he any parents? Asked Fang. He says they died in infancy, your worship, replied the police officer. Oh, yes, I dare say, sneered Mr. Fang. Come, none of your tricks here, you young vagabond. No, I think he really is ill, your worship. Stuff and nonsense, said Mr. Fang. Don't try to make a fool of me. At which point, Oliver fainted. I knew he was shamming, said Mr. Fang, as if this was proof. Let him lie there. You'll soon tire of that. How do you propose to deal with the case, sir? Inquired the clerk in a low voice. Summarily, replied Mr. Fang. He stands committed for 3 months, hard labour. Clear the court. Stop, don't take him away. For heaven's sake, stop a moment. What is this? Who is this? Turn this man out. Clear the court. I will speak, cried the man. I will not be turned out. I saw it all. I keep the bookstall. You must hear me. Swear the man, growled Mr. Fang. Now, man, what have you got to say? This, said the man. I saw 3 boys, 2 others, and this here, loitering while the gentleman was reading. The robbery was committed by another boy. This boy was perfectly amazed by it. Why didn't you come here before? Snapped Mr. Fang. I hadn't a soul to mind my shop, replied the bookseller. I could get nobody till 5 minutes ago, and I've run all the way here. The prosecutor was reading, was he? Snarled Fang. Yes, replied the man. The very book he has in his hand. Oh, that book, eh? Sneered Fang. Unpaid for? A likely fellow to bring a charge against a poor boy. Damn me, cried the old gentleman. Damn me. Clear the court! Officers, do you hear? Clear the court! Mr. Brownlow was conveyed out in indignation and rage. Little Oliver Twist lay on his back on the pavement. I'll help the poor boy. Call a coach, somebody. Dear me, I have this unhappy book still. And, carrying little Oliver and the book, away the coach drove. And so to wrap up the chapter, we get more of an example of what kind of a person Mr. Fang is. Constantly snapping and yelling at other people, going back and forth between people very quickly, in a hurry, it seems to wrap things up, and very quick, on very little evidence, to commit Oliver Twist to 3 months of hard labor. I mean, it's a pretty serious sentence for something with no evidence. Fortunately, and these kind of coincidences or last-minute rescues are pretty common in Dickens, the bookseller himself rushes in to interrupt and provide evidence that he saw what really happened, and that it was two other boys that were responsible, and Oliver Twist was perfectly innocent. Notice near the very end that when it becomes clear that the old gentleman accidentally stole the book, that Fang starts having a go at him. "A likely fellow to bring a charge against a poor boy," he says, and attacks the character of the old gentleman. And through all this, still calling out, "Clear the court, clear the court." So if Dickens is presenting his views of what a court of law is like, at least at this level, it's not a positive one. He's definitely presenting the kind of figure of law in with a certain level of irony. There's a bit of comedy, but it's not a very pleasant comedy. It's borderline incompetent. It's angry and aggressive and entitled. It's all quite negative. The end result of this chapter, though, is that Oliver Twist, who has passed out, he's fainted from the stress and the exhaustion and being ill, gets picked up by the old gentleman, who takes him home. Now, to return to the PowerPoint, the work that we're looking to do today is to write a paragraph similar to last week, answering this question about Dickens and how he is presenting law. A quote has been pulled out for you here in the PowerPoint. "If you stand there refusing to give evidence, I will punish for disrespect. I will." And this quote, one that you can use, is identified for you because it shows a lot about Mr. Fang. Anyone speaking, he feels, is an example of disrespect. Why? Because he sees himself as above everyone else, as the highest figure of authority and respectability in that room. And while he is given a certain power within that room as a magistrate, there's an irony here because he's clearly a very disrespectful person, rude and aggressive and angry and loud. And so, your written work for today is to write an answer to the following question. How does Mr. Fang represent Dickens' ideas about law in Victorian England? And to do that, you can use the example on the screen here, where you're making a point, you're providing some evidence, which is a quote, and then you're explaining, you're clarifying how the evidence supports the point you're making. This triangle here gives you a structure you can follow, but if we move forward one slide, you can see more of an example on how to do this and how you can use the word disrespect, for example, as your evidence, and then you can see here the explanation, the clarification of what's happening. Okay, so this is one paragraph written for you already. I'm going to ask you to write another paragraph using a piece of evidence of your own choice. Now, evidence could be a cluster of words, so you might pick 2 or 3 individual words that share some kind of an idea to say something about Mr. Fang, or you might pull out a completely different quote of your own choice. Okay, this is the basic structure you can follow. It's not set in stone, so you can play with it a little bit. Okay, so this is shown in. You might write instead, by describing Mr. Fang as ... Dickens suggests ... and so on. There's a lot of different ways to approach this. But so, just to be clear, that's your work for today. Please write a paragraph answering the question using this general structure, pulling on quotes from the text. And that's the most important part, really, to be able to pull out a quote from the text that is precise and useful, and then being able to explain, being able to clarify why that quote matters and how it helps you answer the question. Top answers will then be able to link it to a larger idea about Victorian England and what life was like at the time, or what the legal system was like at the time. But that's quite high level, and you might even have to do a little bit of extra research to do that. So there you go. Please do that now. And there you go, 8x2. That is your lesson for today. Good luck with it, and see you next week. And I hope it goes well for you. If you need any help, or if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. Otherwise, keep healthy, keep safe, and goodbye.